arterial supply. The inner 75 to 100 micrometers of endothelial surface of heart gets nutrition directly from the blood in the cardiac chambers. The remaining part of heart muscle is supplied by two coronary arteries, right and left. Each coronary artery is a vasorum of the ascending aorta, because the heart is developed from the fusion of two primitive endothelial tubes which represent the ventral aortae. Anatomically, coronary arteries are not end arteries, but functionally they behave like end arteries. Right coronary artery. It arises from the anterior aortic sinus of the ascending aorta. It is smaller than left coronary artery. Course. After its origin from the ascending aorta, the right coronary artery runs forwards and to the right to emerge on the surface of heart between the root of the pulmonary trunk and the right auricle, and then runs downwards in the right atrioventricular groove up to the junction of the right and the inferior borders of the heart. It winds around the inferior border of heart to reach the diaphragmatic surface of the heart. Here, it runs in the posterior atrioventricular groove up to the crux of the heart, which is the meeting point of interatrial, posterior interventricular, and posterior part of the atrioventricular grooves, where it terminates by anastomosing with the anterior interventricular branch of left coronary artery. Branches. Right conus artery. It is usually the first branch of right coronary artery and supplies the infundibulum of the right ventricle. It anastomoses with the left conus artery from the left coronary artery, forming an arterial circle around the pulmonary trunk known as annulus of Vuesens. Atrial branches. These are arranged in anterior, lateral, and posterior groups. They supply the right atrium. One of the anterior atrial branches is called SA nodal artery. It arises from the right coronary artery in 60% of the cases. Ventricular branches. These are arranged in anterior and posterior groups. 2 to 3 anterior ventricular branches are present and supply the anterior surface of right ventricle. Right marginal artery. It is considered as the longest ventricular ramus. It runs along the inferior border of heart towards the apex and supplies the adjoining surfaces of right ventricle. 2 posterior ventricular branches arise from the right coronary artery and supply the diaphragmatic surface of the right ventricle. Posterior interventricular artery. It arises close to the crux of heart and runs in the posterior interventricular groove. Close to the apex, it terminates by anastomosing with the anterior interventricular branch of left coronary artery. It gives septal branches to posterior 1/3 of interventricular septum. It also supplies the AV node by a circumflex branch. In 10% of cases, posterior interventricular artery is a branch of left coronary artery. Area of distribution. Right atrium. Ventricles. greater part of the right ventricle, except the area joining the anterior interventricular groove, a small part of the left ventricle adjoining the posterior interventricular groove, posterior 1/3 of interventricular septum, whole of the conducting system of heart except a part of the left branch of the AV bundle, left coronary artery. The left coronary artery arises from the left posterior aortic sinus of the ascending aorta. Course: the artery after its origin passes behind the pulmonary trunk and then runs forwards and to the left between the pulmonary trunk and left auricle, where it divides into anterior interventricular and circumflex arteries. Anterior interventricular artery. It runs downwards in the anterior interventricular groove to the apex of the heart. It winds around apex to reach inferior surface, where it lies in the posterior interventricular groove. It ends here by anastomosing with the posterior interventricular branch of right coronary artery. It gives the following branches: anterior ventricular rami. They pass obliquely downwards and outwards and supply both the ventricles. One of the right anterior ventricular rami forms the left conus artery. It forms an arterial ring around the pulmonary trunk along with the right conus artery. It supplies the infundibulum of right ventricle. One of the left anterior ventricular rami is large and is known as the diagonal artery. Circumflex artery. After its origin, it runs in the left part of atrioventricular groove on the sternocostal surface, then winds around the left margin of heart to reach the posterior part of same groove. It terminates on the left side of crux by anastomosing with the right coronary artery. It gives the following branches: left marginal artery. It runs along the left margin of the heart till the apex and supplies the left ventricle. Ventricular branches. Many anterior ventricular branches and posterior ventricular branches are given out, and these supply the inferior surface of left ventricle. Atrial branches. These are in anterior, posterior and lateral groups. They supply the left atrium. Area of distribution. Left atrium. Ventricles. Greater part of the left ventricle, except the area adjoining the posterior interventricular groove. A small part of the right ventricle adjoining the anterior interventricular groove. Anterior part of interventricular septum. A part of the left branch of the AV bundle. Coronary dominance. The variations in the origin and distribution of the posterior interventricular artery decides the status of coronary dominance. In right dominance, posterior interventricular artery arises from the right coronary artery. In left dominance, it arises with the circumflex branch of left coronary artery. In 65% of the population, it is right dominance, and in 35% it is left dominance. In left coronary dominance, population are likely to be affected by coronary diseases because the entire left ventricle and the ventricular septum are under the nutritional control of left coronary artery, and obstruction to posterior interventricular artery. Venous drainage. Venous blood from the heart is drained into right atrium via coronary sinus. Anterior cardiac veins and venae cordis minime. Coronary sinus. It is the largest vein of the heart and lies in the posterior part of atrioventricular groove. The coronary sinus receives about 60% venous blood of the heart. Course. It begins in the left part of the atrioventricular groove and then passes downwards and to the right along the posterior part of the atrioventricular groove. Finally, the sinus ends by opening into the posterior wall of right atrium. The opening lies in between the opening of the inferior vena cava and right atrioventricular orifice and guarded by an incomplete semilunar valve. Tributaries. It receives the following tributaries. Great cardiac vein. It begins from the apex of the heart, runs upwards along the anterior interventricular groove. Here, it accompanies the anterior interventricular artery. Then, it winds around the left border of heart and joins the coronary sinus. Here, it accompanies the circumflex branch of left coronary artery. Before joining the coronary sinus, it receives the left marginal vein. Middle cardiac vein. It passes from the apex along the posterior interventricular groove. Here, it accompanies posterior interventricular artery and terminates close to the right end of the coronary sinus. Small cardiac vein. It is situated in the right posterior atrioventricular groove between the right atrium and right ventricle and opens at the right end of the sinus. Usually, it receives the right marginal vein. Posterior vein of left ventricle. It runs on the diaphragmatic surface of left ventricle and joins the sinus to the left of the middle cardiac vein. Oblique vein of left atrium or oblique vein of Marshall. It is a small vein which runs downwards on the posterior surface of left atrium to enter the left end of the coronary sinus. It develops from the left common cardinal vein or duct of Cuvier, which may sometimes form a large left superior vena cava. Right marginal vein. It accompanies the marginal branch of the right coronary artery and joins the small cardiac vein or drains directly into the right atrium. Left marginal vein opens into the great cardiac vein or into the beginning of coronary sinus. Anterior cardiac vein. These are series of 3 to 4 small veins which run parallel to each other across the surface of right ventricle to open into the right atrium. Venae cordis minime. These are extremely small veins in the walls of all the four chambers of the heart. They open directly into the respective chambers. They are most numerous in the right atrium